Hey, Pastor Charles Wilson here, hanging out today with our family and friends. We just wanted to share a little bit about what's kind of going on in our hearts and what we're feeling, what we're seeing. I don't think we have a specific order or agenda. We just wanted to be honest and transparent. I want to share just a little bit of what's on my heart and what I'm feeling, what I'm seeing. Of course, heartbroken, lamenting, like we all should be with watching the current events, not just the specific incidents, but actually many of the things that are still transpiring. And specifically, speaking from a place as a Christian man who is watching the environments, who loves the Church of Jesus, who wants to have a biblical worldview and how I see the world and how we respond. And for us, we moved here 3 years ago, June, actually, it'll be 3 years. We relocated here from Dallas, Texas to plant a church. And all of our church planning, training, and all the things we learned taught us to go in to build and plant a church in a sustainable context. But after spending almost 6 months in Roanoke, we realized that there's no way of doing that and ignoring the reality on the ground. And that is the history of our city, the history of this region really started playing a part in what we did. In August the 12th, 2017, we had a prayer walk because I realized there was a lot of great gospel preaching churches here. And so I was asking Jesus, why did you send us here? And on that day during our prayer walk, the incident in Charlottesville happened. And that was the day for us that we recalibrated everything that we were doing, and we realized that this should not be, that many of the churches in the valley are homogenous. That is not the reality of even where the churches are located, that they don't reflect their direct communities. And many of those churches and what we see is a result of being intentional. Throughout history, it has just been an intentional thing. The realities in our schools is intentional. People have moved out of the cities, and and the church is part of that, right? The Christian schools are part of people moving out of areas so that their kids could be around other kids who look like them. And I believe that day we are going to have a problem with this next generation if we keep telling them about a Jesus who loves all people, but yet they worship with people who just look like them. They play on soccer teams that are diverse. They go through life with all these different events that are diverse, but when they worship with people who just look like them. And so for us, we felt called to plant a multicultural, multi-ethnic church intentionally without apologizing. I still get pushback on that. People say you should just preach the gospel. You should not intentionally try to develop a church that's multicultural and multi-ethnic, which is insane to me because many of our churches reflect and look the way they do because of intentional actions. In our city, if you drive down a certain street or if you're in a specific quadrant, then there's an economic reality there, but there's often an ethnic reality there. And that shouldn't be. It's 2020, and we are still seeing some of the results that were intentionally done in our city. Roanoke has a history of redlining, of telling people where they can't live. And that's something that is still seen and reflected today. The older generation in our city still feels unwelcome in certain parts of the city, that they shouldn't go downtown, that they shouldn't be a part of different things. And that is something, as a Christian, as a church planter, that I can't ignore, right? I can't just preach the gospel and ignore the realities. Where we're planting our church is a food desert. Where we're planting our church is some of the highest levels of poverty nationally, not just locally, but nationally. That there are people who've been in generational poverty for decade after decade after decade. And there are a lot of great gospel preaching churches there. And so for us, all those things are on our agenda, is to plant a church that preaches the truth, but also brings people into proximity of where life can change, which means we do have to address inequities. We can't ignore it. I can't just preach the gospel in a community where there's high levels of children with diabetes because there's no grocery store and think that I'm being effective if I'm not helping. If there are children, I subbed in the schools and there's children who can't read in ninth grade, well, that's a gospel issue, right? Like I can't just ignore that and go, that's social justice. If children can't read, they can't read the Bible. I mean, if you want a closer connection to the gospel, then if you can't read, you can't even read the Bible itself. And so maneuvering to kind of silence people who are trying to do things that feel a little out of your comfort zone is, to me, comes from a very evil place if it makes me reconsider some of the gospel efforts Jesus is calling me to do. Now, if I move away from the scriptures with my efforts, then yes, I should be criticized and critiqued appropriately. But if feeding people and worrying about there being a grocery store or bringing different people together offends you, then I think, quite honestly, there's a group who claim the name of Christ who I think have walked away from the Jesus of the Bible. That's my personal feeling, that I don't think we're looking in the same scriptures, and I don't think we're in step with, we claim very highly to orthodoxy, but I think our orthopraxy is pathetic. And those are some of the things that Dr. King would have been criticized on, is because they would say he wasn't that orthodox. But it's pretty interesting how his orthopraxy and the way he lived out his life looked far better than those who have a high view or a high value on orthodoxy, but couldn't get it right in the practical application. That's just some of my venting and some of my heart.
I'm Michael Duval. I'm the lead pastor of Journey Church, and I'm so glad, Charles, that you're here with us to share with us today. In this time when racism is plaguing our land, I'm curious if you would share some about your own personal experience of racism and how that's affected your view of the church and your calling from God.
Yeah. So, even before I was aware of it, there were things happening, I guess, in my life that I didn't realize was because of just being an African American. Some of the early things as a teenager, I do remember racial profiling. I grew up in New Jersey, and there was a long stretch of time there where racial profiling was a reality. And I remember getting pulled over time after time, and being spoken to by police officers in a very unfriendly manner. But it became a way of life for me, and I just expected it. And I didn't realize I was being conditioned to accept it, that there are times where I would be targeted over other people and I would be looked at. And so eventually it's something I had to teach my own sons. We have 2 boys. Our oldest would be 22, our youngest would be 19 next month. And having that conversation with our boys was another one of those realities where we had to share with them. You'd be in the car with your friends and you'll probably be isolated out as the only African American in that car.
And how hard was that for you to have a conversation with your sons about that?
It wasn't hard, but only because I felt like they didn't get it at the time. I think they thought I was just talking, because their reality, they for the most part, they've only had glimpses of things in school where kids would say you're dirty and you can't get clean, or that you can't come over to my house. My younger son, they had a vote in elementary school on who would be president, and I remember majority of the kids voted for President Barack Obama, and it was a elementary school election, and his friend said, you can never come over to my house because of who you voted for. And my kid came home laughing and confused. I knew what he meant, and his friend knew exactly what his parents would think of my son. And so it was hard at the time in elementary school to communicate to my son what that meant, just because of that in school. And so one of the reasons we moved here is we dropped our son off at Liberty University. I graduated from Liberty University, and the year before he left was during the time of the police shootings in Dallas. And we had that conversation with him also. But it wasn't until his experience at Liberty when he realized, he was in the room with people who were racist. He had a lot of experiences on campus, and he came home after that first semester realizing everything I told him about being in the car, everything we told him about the police shootings, that he lived in Dallas during the time, he really didn't quite grasp. But it was that first semester at his Christian university where he experienced racism and was kind of awoken to the reality of the world.
I'm having trouble finding the words to talk today about what's going on in our culture, in our nation. And what occurred with George Floyd has ignited in many people fear and anger and bewilderment. And as I've tried to think through this as a follower of Jesus, the image that's come to my mind again and again is of one policeman who had his knee down on a man whose skin was darker, but I've been envisioning that was Jesus that knee was down on. And the governmental authorities ended his life. As an Anglo male, it's hard for me to comprehend what that might mean for people of color. And my predominant emotion at this point is just intense sadness and grieving. But other people have other experiences. I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
So I would say it would almost be the opposite in a sense where I'm not surprised. I'm not looking even at this incident like it's the most grotesque incident. That for me, it's all right. It's another day, and it's recorded. People see it. We're angry, frustrated, heartbroken, saddened, and next week it's almost like the expectation is next week we'll see this again. And I guess the other side of it, where some of the frustration and anger comes, is when it's brought up or when someone tries to highlight it. It's almost like, even from my Christian brothers and sisters, it's almost a yelling of, what are you talking about? Why, that isn't true. That doesn't exist. We shouldn't, stop focusing on that. That's not anything to focus on. And the parallel there would be, Colin Kaepernick, as he is saying, okay, I'm going to kneel because I want to bring attention to police brutality. And for the majority of people would say, you are being disruptive, you're disrespecting our troops, which is a whole weird argument because it has nothing to do, his whole platform had nothing to do with the troops. But that kind of goes back to a whole nother thing where the association there came from. But he's not communicating that. He's saying, I want to bring attention to that. And it's, and you have from the highest levels of leadership, people saying, don't do that. And then you have people in the culture who want to, rally and do different things, and it's like, don't do that. And so it's all right, so don't do peaceful things. It's basically saying, just shut up about it. Just shut up, don't talk about it, don't bring it up, just ignore it, be hurt in silence. I remember when the police shootings happened in Dallas, and right before that, when they were showing video after video of different gentlemen being shot, and just the pain on my wife's face and the tears in her eyes, because she's thinking, I have an African-American husband, I have African-American sons, and there is absolutely nothing. There is no one defending them. The people who are assigned to protect them actually have the authority to take their lives. And for many of them, there was no justice, there was no accountability, and there was no prison time for many of them. And so just hearing that over and over, and then you get, even with this argument, as we watch some of the news, people are saying, well, he died from other things. And so the first autopsy comes back and says that there was something. Then the second autopsy comes back and says, no, he was strangled, he was choked to death. But even people who are trying, it's almost like, again, there's this wiggle room of saying, well, it isn't first degree murder if he died from something else. And it's almost like you don't care about humans, because you're trying to take the air out of an argument that you feel as though is against you. And it's just a little frustrating there. And then when I hear that, because sometimes I read the comments, when I hear that from people who I know or would say they love Jesus and would say they care about all people and would jump on airplanes and go to foreign countries to spread the gospel, but to hear that type of stuff is very hurtful. So when I see an officer on top of a man, the man dies, and he's there for 3 more minutes after the man is dead, still there, the image in my mind is, again, here we go again, and I can almost set my clock for the next one, is the initial thought.
I heard you speak, Charles, about what I understand to be systemic racism. You said this isn't a one-time event. Would you share your a little bit more about your own personal experience with systemic racism.
So that's for the most part, I would be speaking from the outside, or a person with privilege who doesn't always feel all the effects of systemic racism. You know, in my context, growing up, in 9th, 10th grade, one of my friends said, "You're the only person that I know whose mom and dad is married and is together." I never realized the privilege, which, you know, is what some would consider normal, the privilege other people, African Americans, were seeing that I had. And so with my dad being in the household, but not only that, my mom's parents were married all the way, you know, until they both passed away. And so I kind of experienced something that was a little rare. And so there are many opportunities that were afforded to me where, for instance, when I got those speeding tickets from police officers, my dad's attorney was able to help me navigate through that, which is an advantage that other people who look like me, where I come from, wouldn't have had. And so it only takes one or two of those instances where an African American will lose his license, which doesn't afford him a job, doesn't afford him education, and so it just piles on in a way that I was able to kind of maneuver through, if that makes sense. And so for the most part, you know, I've moved twice. You know, there are people in poverty who've never moved before. I've lived in New Jersey, I lived in Dallas, and now I lived here in Roanoke, all at my choice. And some people will say, well, why don't you just move away from troubled neighborhoods? Well, if you are in a climate of continuous poverty, it isn't that, you know, possible. I could call home to my dad and say, hey, Dad, can you send me $500? And so I would say, even from my privileged position, there are times where there may have been something stacked against me that I still have enough support and resources to get out of. I wasn't, you know, we lived in a predominantly African-American suburb community out of the necessity of safety. And that's just kind of how neighborhoods were, you know, would be created, where people lived around people so that they would feel safe. I didn't know that growing up. I just thought my neighborhood was normal. And I realized looking back, no, that was intentional. You know, people of color lived near people of color, one, because they couldn't live in other places, and two, wanted to feel safe around people. And then when I went to school, it was a very diverse context. And so I was definitely a minority in school. And for the most part, growing up in school, I didn't feel all of the effects that some people would have felt. But that was partly because of where I lived, you know, growing up in South Jersey.
So I'm hearing you say that in the African American experience, it's not monolithic. There are vast differences of experience in the African American community. There are vast differences of experience in the Anglo American community. So, for example, I grew up where my parents stayed together, but both of my parents were alcoholics. And their perceptions of racial relationships were very different. And so I got very mixed messages growing up. You talked about redlining and the different communities. I grew up in a small community where literally the other side of the tracks did divide the housing for people who were African American from Anglo American. And one did not really cross the tracks back in those days, except for my dad, who was a friend of whom we call Big Mike. His name was Mike Pulliam. Mike was an African-American man who was a handyman. He could fix things, and we could not. And from my dad, I got the message, well, it's Big Mike. No different, it's just Big Mike. And so when he would come fix things, if it would be hot outside, he'd be invited in by my dad and, you know, have a glass of water. But if my dad was not there, the different message from my mom was, Big Mike couldn't come in the house. He had to sit on the back steps. And so even within racial groups, there's a significant difference of perceptions in doing that. And I found that confusing as a young person. I imagine like your kid, it's just confusing in how that all happens. So I'm curious what you would say are appropriate steps to be taken for followers of Jesus to not to deny, I think I heard you say to, if I can use the image, to put under the rug, to address these things that grieve the heart of God when brothers and sisters in Christ are isolated and separated from one another because of race, when Jesus desires that we be one and unified.
And I think that final part you just said, I think we assume in Christianity that unity means uniformity. Being together, for instance, the multicultural church experiment really says that a dominant culture gathering wants everyone to assimilate to look like the dominant culture. And we've seen that over the last 15 years where African Americans would join churches that are predominantly white, and the idea is for them to assimilate to look like the dominant culture, and that's what Christianity is. Well, really, if we are different, if there's some big mics and there's a little bit of everything, that means, I have some great friends from the Caribbean who, when they communicate, they yell. And for some people, that seems unpeaceful. Well, if they're part of the family, you can't just sweep that under the rug and say, no, that's not how we communicate. Well, no, what you're saying, what we're saying in a sense is culture is sinful. But culture isn't sinful. Culture is how we do things. And so if a group of people, if the way they communicate in a large family is by yelling at each other because they want to get their point across, culturally, that's how they show love that way, they do different things that way. And there are elements in culture that can be sinful, but culture in itself isn't sinful. And that's part of the problem with what we are calling, what the church should be, is that we're telling people you can come in, but you have to be transformed into not the image of Christ, but to the image of what the church looks like. And so people who talk loud and yell, you need to be quiet, you need to dress this way, you need to do this way. And what we're saying is that your culture or your ethnicity is wrong. And you need to tone that down, and you need to talk like this, or you need to look like this. And that's, I think, one of the big problems. And we saw that with the kind of the exodus after the election, that there were a lot of churches in Dallas who were would have classified as multicultural because maybe about 17% were minorities. But the language that was coming out from their pastors and the language that was coming out overwhelmingly made them feel uncomfortable. Not necessarily that they didn't want to vote a certain way, but they realized for the first time that they were being assimilated into an environment that told them that their ethnicity was wrong. And they didn't even feel it. They were there for years and didn't feel it until it came time for something on the national level that big. And that's just a lot of assimilation. What we should be doing is saying, listen, you are inherently sinful. You are inherently, just because you dress this way or you look this way or you talk this way, it isn't wrong. That if everyone's coming into this big gathering, that means we're going to have some people who talk this way and they eat these weird things and they do this way, and you are still part of the family. Instead of saying you need to drop that, you need to stop that, you need to dress this way, that's where some of the problem has happened.
Because though there may be cultural differences, we each have been created in the very image of God. And that's the focus. You and I have many similarities. We're husbands, and we're dads, and we're pastors, and we're males, and we have things that are in common. We have some things that are different about us, but what is crucial is our identity in Christ. And it seems that this division in our country oftentimes is related to, we've lost that sense of the other, rather than the image you use. We're part of the family of God because we're created in the very image of God.
Yeah. When we go to our family reunion, right? We all have that weird cousin who does something, but
I am the weird cousin.
Right. And no one goes, our weird Mike can't come, right? Mike, no, man, how you been? We got stories, you still, drink Kool-Aid, like you still eat pickles and dip it in mustard, all the weird things you do, none of that should exclude you from being part of the family. And it is uncomfortable, but we're not called to be people that are of comfort. Like, if we can understand jumping on an airplane and going into a foreign country to share the gospel with people, how can we not get that even in our context? It's because we want the lazy, easy way out. We want everyone to look like us and talk like us and think like us. We don't We don't want the nuance. We don't want, anything that kind of ruffles our feathers. And so what we do is we just slam down and say, this is the line here, and you need to start conforming and coming over here. We want our weird cousin to dress like us. We don't want you. And that isn't how Jesus did it. Jesus pressed in to the woman at the well, who even her own cultural context would have pushed her out because of her history and her background. And Jesus pushed in, and then he used her to be an evangelist. I mean, that is not the way the church does it. The church, we do it differently. We want her to be cleaned up and for her to look like us and talk like us and drink like us and do everything. And now you can be an evangelist. And Jesus pushed always, he made the hero of the story the person they hated the most. He made the hero the Samaritan, and then he made the villain the religious person. Because the religious person stepped to the other side when the Samaritan, think about this picture. The injured person, you got the religious person, you got the Levite who steps to the other side. Then you get the Samaritan who to them, this is an atrocity that he's using them as the hero. The Samaritan did not say, what did you do to be in this situation? Never asked the question. Jesus doesn't put that in the story. He doesn't say, well, maybe you did this and you deserve that. Never asked those questions. Picked them up, cleaned them up, bandaged them up. Then he took them, put them in the inn, and he said to the innkeeper, listen, if there's any more things that come up, if his bill goes any higher, let me know, because when I come back, I'll take care of it. That is over and beyond before he even engaged in conversation with him. And this is what we're missing, when we see these images of someone's knee on someone's throat. We're going, well, what did he do first? So we're waiting for the footage, right? I have great friends who are missionaries who their number one line is, well, I've learned to wait to see the rest of the footage. Like, we can't lament the fact that a man is dead here. We can't lament the fact that a mom has to bury her son because he went out jogging, and we're waiting to see the rest of the footage, but the people who killed him have gone home for the next 2.5 months to go sleep in their bed and play with their kids. She's already had her funeral before it even hits the day of light. We can't lament that. We still need to wait a little more time before we even mourn with those who are mourning. Like, that is just simple Christianity. Mourn with those who are mourning. Stop asking questions. What did he do? Why did he deserve it? Mourn with those who are mourning. Period. There is no, unless the guy who's in the ditch did something to deserve it, then do like the Levite did, or do like, the religious leader did. And so, yeah, that to me, I think this is what I mean when I say I feel as though there's a large group of people who've just walked away from the gospel that we cherish. That mourn with those who's mourning is simple. Love your neighbor is just simple, basic, some of the first chapters in the gospel. It isn't the deep stuff at the end in Revelation. This is like chapter 1, the Beatitudes, like, the poor and those who are hungry. And so, yeah, I'm wrestling today with that as a gospel-loving man of God, and listening to the rhetoric and watching the church step away from people, and be afraid to step to people or closer.
And as I recall, we don't know the race of the wounded man, the socioeconomic status of the wounded man, because he had no clothes on.
Right, or woman, right? Well, I guess man.
I think we knew he was a man.
He was a man.
In doing that. We do know those who walked by on the other side and who did not have compassion were some of the most perceived religious people in the community. And yet in reality, Jesus was saying they were furthest away from God because they were not compassionate to the one who was broken and who was hurting, regardless of how they came to be in that way. Another scripture that comes to my mind is Paul's letter to the Galatian church, where there were people saying, you have to be this way to be a part of the church. Very legalistic, pharisaical. And so I think the challenge of racism for younger people today, whether they be African American or Anglo-American, who are seeking to live the Jesus way, is they perceive a hypocrisy that is turning them away from God, when it is the false righteousness of those of us who have not heard and lived out the gospel.
Two scriptures that I'm loving right now, just to piggyback off of what you just said, the prodigal son, he, decides he doesn't want any part of his dad's stuff anymore. He wants to go. He wants to take his resources to go, and he leaves, and he goes and he lives a deplorable life. Now we don't know the details of how he did everything he did, but his brother did, because his brother says things that weren't even mentioned in the first part. He spent his money on prostitutes. Like, that never came up before.
We know what his temptation
Right.
was.
And then the picture of the dad who's looking and waiting for the son, he sees him from afar off, he grabs him, he clothes him, he brings him back in. He doesn't even give him a chance to give his whole message out. But then the brother didn't come to the party. And the picture in that story to me is the person who was really lost was the brother who never left, the one who stayed in the house with the dad, the one who heard the teaching of the father, the one who would have been considered the more righteous one was the one whose heart was furthest from the heart of the father. And if we can't, like, if there's anything I see even in our church today, is that we think that we can be in the scriptures and have a deep devotion and be close to the Lord and sing worship songs, and that our heart cannot be far from God, then we need to take a better look at Joshua when he is getting ready to march in, and he stands there, and the commander of the Lord's army stands there, and Joshua, who's under this idea that because he's the successor of Moses and that God has given him direction and he's given him a charge, that everything he does is on God's side. And when he steps to the general said, and he asks, "Are you with us or are you with them?" As if there was only two options. If that doesn't sound like our culture today, there's just two options. And the commander of the Lord's army says, "Neither." That there's actually a third option, that we are not always, even as Christians, right, that we can just be like we can think, well, we're just going to align with this association, or we're going to align with this party, and God isn't always I think we just think it's that black and white, where no, neither. Like, that isn't just God's move right now, or you can have all these other things right and still be out of step here. And this is, I think, the message of that passage is this: neither. Like Joshua, don't think for a second that you won't make mistakes, that you're perfect, that you're actually God. Like, you need to constantly be in tune and focusing so that your heart doesn't drift. And for our church today, I think many of us have drifted in a way where we just assume that we're just right, and that no, we can be followers who love Jesus and still be wrong.
Some of the models that I have for trying to live the Jesus way ended up being very unexpected by me. Again, I shared how I grew up in a home that had varying views of race. So I left there, being the young redneck that I was, and went to college, and did not know who my roommate would be. And walked in, and lo and behold, my roommate is a young man who's in his late 20s from Africa. He had fought in a Nigerian war, was a soldier, and he was tough. But he had the most Christ-like spirit of humility. And it was a unique experience for me to learn from someone of a different race who was much stronger, much bigger, would be perceived in a different way than, short redneck me, but who had a meekness and a calmness and a deep desire to follow Jesus. And I think, Charles, that in the American church, we sometimes lose that sense of it's not all about me, but it's caring for those who are in need, like you said, as a good Samaritan. And how does one balance that with, there are times to be humble and meek, but then there's this sense of anger that Jesus experienced when there was wrongdoing and oppression and taking advantage of and exploiting people?
When we see that picture clearly when he flips the table, he flipped the table that was prohibiting in the court of the Gentiles, which I think there's a little bit of an ethnic conversation going on there that we're missing, that the Jewish people were still able to get access to God. The Jewish women would still have access to God. The religious leaders are watching the change tables happening and all of this stuff interacting in the court of the Gentiles, which that's a specific group of people who did not have the access everyone else had. And then Jesus says clearly, my Father's house is a house of all people, right? I think there's an ethnic issue that the religious leaders are missing here. And Jesus is clearly saying, oh, everyone should be able to come here. I think I don't use the term race because I think it's a created term to kind of identify people. And I think it further creates this sense that we're different. And if my Bible is right, then we are related. We all come from the same two people. And so I use ethnic, that there are, that it's almost more cultural than anything, some of our differences. Genetically, obviously, we have many, for the most part, the same. And so sometimes when I hear that, it feels a little bit like we're still separating. So I do sidestep that term. But yeah, I think even in teaching and preaching the Bible, especially if you're going to go through Acts or many of the passages, that there are ethnic conversations there that would help our people if we actually preached them with the honest context of what's happening there. That when we're talking about Peter getting up from the table with the Gentiles, that this is him. He's missing that he's been part of a new people group, no longer part of the old people group, but he's a part of a new people group that he should not be worried about disassociating himself from. And what that would have done to the Gentiles, it would have made them feel a type of way because he's now moving to be back with the Jews. And those are the conversations that we should be, like if we preach that in its ethnic truth, then now the people in our congregation are having to think through, are there things that I do around certain friends or certain people that I'm ashamed to be their friend, or, because we see this in all honesty, right? The scripture is written in a way where it's not lying. It's telling us the good and the bad. And so now we get to work that out in, our worship context, in our relationships. If you go through the last 30 people that you've called or text or your friends, and if you don't have anyone of another people group in there or an ethnic group, if that means you're really not in proximity with other people, which is a question, why? Why isn't your life intersecting with people? And I'm not, and especially, you guys are out here in the county, right? And so I'm sure plenty of your people live in places where it may be everyone around them looks like them, but being multicultural, multi-ethnic doesn't just mean like, pigment. Or your church or your business, you should be in relationship with people this person who may own the shop and the person who sweeps the shop. And they could be of the same ethnic group. But if you are only around people who own shops, that's a problem. That's a problem for your children. It's a problem for you. It's a problem for how you process and see the rest of the world, because you only see and have conversations with a business owner mindset, and you're never engaging with the person who's sweeping the shop. And that should be, a test for our churches. That are we just filled with people who own shops, or is there a mix here where people who sweep the shop feel safe and welcome here? And that our illustrations, can be related to by people who sweep shops and own shops, who watch Channel 13 and who watch Channel 7, who are, a little left and a little right. Like there's enough here for everyone to feel as though I don't have to drop all of my cultural stuff to be here, that the gospel is wide enough and big enough for us to have some honest conversations, so that you can very conservative views, and I could be on the left side, or you could be on the left, and I could be on the right, and we can fuss and we can argue, and we could go, that is a bad idea. I can't believe you want to do that. You guys don't want to put sidewalks over here on 3rd Street because you don't care about children, and it's taking down the we can have those arguments in a gospel way that loves Jesus, but go, man, I don't like your ideas, but I love you because you're my brother. And I'm going to be back next week, and I'll bring the coffee, you bring the macaroni and cheese, and we're going to have some of these arguments again, and we're not giving up on each other, and I'm not just going to go find people who think like me.
Because in Galatians 3:28, in Christ, there is neither male nor female, Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free. And I have been a janitor, just so you know, and have done those things. Charles, we've been witnessing protests around the world, in our country, in our community. And I want to share a little bit about where I am on protests. When in college, I was confronted with some authorities who were making decisions that were not right. And so I led a major college protest march with a walkout to pressure authorities to choose to do what was right and legal. I am a person who believes there is significant value in peaceful protest movements to communicate a message clearly in the public realm when wrongs are being done. We're seeing a variety of protests now, many of which are peaceful, and I personally support them in a significant way so that injustice can be confronted and authorities can be held accountable. And yet, I'm concerned about when protests move toward violence and looting. That's my perspective.
I definitely agree. I think people need to voice. I think there needs to be an outlet. I think a demonstration is really what it should be, a demonstration that people are upset and frustrated. I think there's a way of us ignoring things until it gets the appropriate attention sometimes. And so we've seen it in the past where it's helpful, where it's gotten the attention of people. We've seen it in the past where it's escalated to, burnings and violence and crime and all types of different things. And so as a person who, as a pastor, so I struggle with the fact that I care for everyone's safety and I don't want no one hurt, but I also want people to yell and be angry and tell people this is wrong, this needs to stop. And I believe in speaking truth to power. I believe, just as the prophets of old who would stand before the king who was out of line with the Lord and say, you are wrong. When that king has the ability to kill them, that there is power in that, where the person is saying, I know I'm putting myself on the line. I'm putting myself out here. And in our culture today, all it takes is one video or someone seeing you out there and you can be fired from your job in ways that wouldn't have happened before. I lived in Dallas when there was the infamous pool party. It hit the national news where there was some African-American kids who were at a pool party and it turned racial, and then the police were called. And what hit the news was there was a young 13-year-old girl and a police officer was on her back and he was cuffing her and he slung her to the ground. And I had kids from my church that were there. And the interesting thing though with this event was where it happened and who it happened to. It wasn't just an African-American young girl, but this was an upward community. I mean, you're talking this isn't middle class. This is definitely upper class community. So everyone there, their parents made well over $150,000, $200,000 a year. And the way that was handled is way different than some of these other instances are handled, because most of their parents and the people who live in that community had influence. And so there was one protest, the police officer was fired, and it was done away with. Part of it is we lived in where Money Magazine labeled our community #1 in America. And so McKinney, Texas at the time was just an affluent place to be, but there were also people there of influence and wealth who could handle a problem, make a phone call to the right and appropriate person, and deal with the entire incident immediately. Well, on that side of town, you don't have laundromats and you don't have liquor stores, you don't have some of the things that you have in other communities. And so, but if this would have happened on the other side of the highway,
on the side of the tracks,
this would have been, and literally in McKinney, Texas, if you go on the other side of 75, the highway, you do have liquor stores and you do have, laundromats. And we don't take those things as if there's something to be said. But I will say this, you don't have the access to pick up the phone and call someone and get someone fired or deal with things a certain way. And so how could we, it's just, when the scripture talks about a person who steals bread, and going, well, though stealing is wrong, we have a commandment that says, "Thou shalt not steal." Who couldn't understand a person starving stealing bread? And so I do understand anger, frustration, and I understand an environment that is charged for trouble. So yeah, I am 100% on board. I think there needs to be a voice, but at the same time, we have to understand that when we do gather because of charged events, that there is a high potential of something happening, and it's just part of it. So we can't say we're with peaceful protest knowing there is nothing but anger and frustration and confusion in the hearts of so many people. And then, of course, we have people who have no good intention, and they didn't even come because of the issue. They just came because they want to incite something. And then as a person who loves clarity, I'm trying to win over my brother and sister who's not listening to the conversation. And now all they're going is, see, this is why. And so the looting now takes center stage, and no longer is the loss of life important. Now, and I'm not even saying that's for everyone, but I do know that there's a demographic of people who will not talk about nothing but the looting now, and they have never talked about the death. And I wish they would even look at their timeline and go, you know what? I've written 5 posts about the looting, but I've never said we need to lament the loss of life ever when these incidences happen.
Because they're 2 separate events.
They're completely 2 separate events, yeah. And we're smart enough to go, yeah, this has nothing to do with that. But if we want to, if we don't want to, then we can go, all right, we're just going to look at this. And I will say this, as a Christian man who reads the Bible, who understands evil in this world, I am not confused. I am not bewildered by the reality that people hate other people. As a black man, I am completely aware that there are people who see me and automatically categorize me. I've just lived through life that way, understanding it. That I have to explain myself when I enter a room, that I have to explain that I'm safe, that I have to be aware of the people around me, that I have to be aware of where I'm at, even throughout the city, if I'm in the county or somewhere else, that I need to communicate, I feel the need to communicate something. And so I understand that. I understand that part, and I don't feel like I need to expect a utopia or some place where this never happens. The only area where I get frustrated is the church, because I do expect A, B, C, or D. The world is the world, and it's going to do its thing, and I'm not confused by that, but I am confused when I see it in a space where I'm supposed to be a part of with my brothers and sisters, and then I experience those same things.
I'm a little confused by it. I hear you're not. I'm upset about it. I get angry about it. And my experience is different than yours, because most of the time I don't feel unsafe in moving about the community. I have experience having worked in the realm of law enforcement, engaged in Christian ministry as a prison chaplain. And I learned during that experience from just a wonderful Christ-like woman. Her name was Jency Fields. Jency happened to be African American. And she would say to me, because I was young, I was 22 years old, and she would say, Michael, there are good people and bad people in this prison. There are good people who are African American, and there are good people who are Anglo American. There are bad people who are African American and bad people who are Anglo American. And then she'd say, and there are good people and bad people who work in law enforcement. She did not see it as everybody is bad, everybody is good. We all have the potential to do good or bad things. But she was candid with me when I first started in the law enforcement realm. There are many people who are wonderful, but there are other people who have different motives, who choose to do things that are evil. Right. And I think when I say confusing, sometimes it's still hard for me to wrap my head around people who are supposed to protect others indeed bring hurt to people. And I think that is one of the things, particularly for young adults, they're trying to figure that out and how to deal with the emotional anger over that.
And that's where I find hope. I find hope right where there's that tension. If there was no confusion or frustration or anger, then I would be saddened. But we see these things and we go, that's not right. And until we get to a place where we go, that's normal, and yeah, police kill people for no reason, that's where I go, all right, we're in trouble. But I think for the most part, most people, I would guess at this point, most people look at injustice and go, it's unjust. Now, we have different views on how we solve it and fix the problem, but I think we still live in a place where we go, that isn't right, that shouldn't have happened. And that's what I'm excited for young people, because they see those things and they go, it isn't right and it shouldn't happen. But I don't want them to lose hope. And I know a lot of young African American people who are finding themselves a little hopeless and a little bewildered because they believe that there is no hope and that there is no answer, and that this is just the way it's always going to be. And so they're giving up on trying. I'm just wired a little different. I believe we should be continuously working towards solving problems, addressing things, and intentionally making things uncomfortable so we can have a full conversation, and not just trying to quiet everything down, but to just become more used to having hard conversations where we should definitely encourage versus just try to quiet everything down and just bring silence.
When you speak of hope, I think back to Jency, my friend. And I think if we can approach one another as brothers and sisters in Christ, even though we may have some ethnic differences, one of the most honoring experiences I've had in my life is, tragically, Jency's husband was killed in an accident when I was a chaplain there. And she asked me to be one of the pallbearers. I was pretty much the only Anglo person at this funeral. But I had the privilege of doing that. When you talk about hope, I think that gives me hope that people who may have had the experience of discrimination and prejudice are the norm. Right. That's what we grew up with. When we come to follow Jesus, that can change. And that's the hope that I have for those of us who are followers of Christ. And I think somehow we need to get that message out that more clearly, and we need to listen to one another's stories, and we need to take actions to engage in justice ministries or justice actions so that it becomes concrete and not just words.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things I would say, to be honest about, is that the church has historically, most of the major denominations have, written repentance over the last 15 years of just their part in racism or slavery and things like that. And I think, it's important when we talk about lamenting. We definitely have to think through the history, where we are, how we got here, what have we been ignoring, so that we don't keep making the same mistakes. If we don't, and if this goes back to being normal and we just kind of go back to life, it's kind of like the virus, right? Everyone can't wait to get back to normal life. And I think there's just a lot of sweet things in here that the Lord wants to teach us to make us better people before we get back to normal life. But if we get back to normal life, then we would have punted again at a time where we have a beautiful opportunity to stop, lament, look at the message young African Americans are hearing. Don't peacefully protest. Don't say anything. Look at these riots. And all they're hearing, if you just take a few seconds to think about that, all they're hearing is, shut up and don't say anything. Because if you kneel at a football game, you're against the troops. If you assemble peacefully, you're going to cause riots. If you speak up and make everyone uncomfortable, you're just a bad person. And think about how confusing that would be even for a Christian person who understands justice and what justice really looks like. That Jesus did not quiet his mouth. He spoke out against injustice and against the religious leaders who were out of step. And then he stood before the king and he said, listen, the most powerful person who wants to take his life. And he has this clear picture of the more important thing, that giving in to what's wrong or sin, like Satan tried to tempt him to, in the midst of a kingdom that's limited, right? The person who put him on the cross had a limited kingdom, but Jesus was extending to all of us an eternal kingdom that we can be in that has no expiration date. And this is where I get hope, is because I'm a part of that. And that I am in the midst of a time where there is broken and inequity, and that I want to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. But in the midst of doing that, I get to address these things for all people.
And candidly, I want to be very hopeful. And yet, I lived through the late 1960s with the assassination of Dr. King and the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and the race riots and the burning of the cities in the inner core. And I want to be hopeful, Charles. But in some ways, this is a replaying. Yeah. As you talked about, you have a sense, well, this is just not new. I'm praying first to look inside myself to see if there's any way I'm contributing to the problem. And I want to engage in meaningful dialogue with people of what are some concrete ways we can address this. In many ways, for younger folks, I've got children, you've got children, that there would be a transformed world where we would see one another as being in the image of Christ. And yes, we have some differences, but we need to be unified and work together and be able to express our fears and our anger, because whenever we're threatened, that's what we feel. And I feel some degree of threat for the future of our world, but my response is mostly fear. But I hear you saying the response of many people is just anger. What do you suggest folks do with that stuff?
I believe, and this is where I know a lot of young people are frustrated, I believe every day we should be working in these areas. Now, those contributions can be small, like the relationship you had with the lady in the prison. She's helping shaping your worldview. And I mean, that's a contribution that's helped you on your course of just how you view the world. And sometimes I know younger people want to see bigger, wider, right now things. If this is the day you begin working towards things and seeing things, you're late. And there are different people who are on the highway. Some are just getting on the lane. Some are speeding along because they've been on the highway for a while. And that's where I get a little nervous with this conversation, because I don't want to scare the person who's just getting on and experiencing this conversation, because they're going to exit off the next exit and go, that's just too hard and it's uncomfortable. I want them to speed up a little bit and get in step with everyone else, which means, you have to inform yourself. You have to read. You need to know, why things are before you just say, well, those people are there because they are lazy or they chose to be there, but you don't know the history of why they got there. If you take something like the Berglund Center here, who sits right off of 460, and you drive up and down that all the time, but you've never noticed the historic African-American cemetery to the right side of that used to spread across 460, that went into the parking lot, where all those bodies were dug up and dumped in a mass grave in Bedford, and what that said to the people who live there. When you drive by 460, you're just on your way to the Berglund Center or the mall. But when they drive by 460, they are reminded of just those efforts. Or even when they go to the Berglund Center, right? That was an African-American community where people lived at one point, and that they were eminent domain, came along and said, we're building a highway and these houses are no good, and we're going to move you forward up into the Northwest community in which people started. Then the apartments were built. Those are intentional moves away from a community that changed to be black by the church. People remember those things. They know those things. They feel those things. And to ignore it, it's just literally like driving down 460, going past that cemetery, and just not even thinking through what this means for other people.
Because it's a historical pattern.
It is a historical pattern that they remember very well. There are people who still feel the shocks, they still feel the pain, they feel the disrespect by their own city, by the leadership of their own city, who could care less about them. All the way down to the Coca-Cola plant over in Northwest. That was a neighborhood before Coca-Cola got there. And those homes and those streets were removed, people who worked very hard to get their property. And so just going, hey, we just need to ignore it, get back to a peaceful time. If we haven't even stepped into those simple things, because those are easy things to even know about your own city, and how it's shaped and conditioned people versus just looking at the news and going, "Up, there's those people again over there in that community." Well, some of that disruption happened intentionally, where other people profited, and so.
Charles, I'm aware of a number of people, most of whom have very good hearts, who are concerned because they're not sure what to say or how to say it, if it'll be misperceived or it would offend people.
I think we definitely need to attack that excuse. I think some of that to me can be, and I know a lot of African Americans are looking at that as that's almost kind of a self-preserving. Again, it's another way of just kind of hiding out. If it was something very important to you, it wouldn't be that hard of a thing to address. If it was a family member, you would find a way to get in there, and you wouldn't be as concerned. You probably will say the wrong thing. You probably will offend someone. If you aren't putting in the work to pick up some books like Letters to a Birmingham Jail and reading through some of these arguments and things to see even how the Christian community was struggling through these things, then yes, you just want the easy way out. And I'll give you 5 ways to address racism in America. And to have an easy way of getting through that. It doesn't exist. Like if there was one, we'd all learn it in 3rd grade. It is complex. It is hard. I have friends who say, should I say African American or Black? Well, the answer is, I don't know. It depends on who you're talking to. Someone finds that offensive. Someone else doesn't find it offensive. I don't find either one offensive. My wife finds, if you call me Black, offensive. And we come from very similar backgrounds, very similar family structures, very similar areas, and we both view that differently. I know a Southern person who says Black in a way that does sound a little bit like they're suggesting something, but I know that their heart isn't suggesting anything. And so one of the ways of addressing that is asking the question. You can't do that if you're not in a relationship and you're not in proximity. Like that is the key right there, is to be in proximity with people that you can ask those questions, to have relationships, real relationships. And that isn't just African Americans, right? I did a message 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago before Ahmaud Arbery came out, addressing racism towards Asian Americans. And I did an interview with an Asian pastor in Roanoke, and we talked back and forth about how he's feeling during this time and the racism that's hitting Asian Americans, because as a believer, right, just because something is affecting me doesn't mean that's the only time I'm talking about it. I'm offended as a Christian because my Asian brother and sisters are going through. I mean, there's got to be a sense of consistency with this conversation, or I'm just, looking for a low-hanging fruit and the easy way out. And we should be on all levels. If it's injustice towards women, if it's injustice towards whoever, it should be a consistent conversation. As a Christian, right, I should be seeking justice, and I should be offended when I hear of these offenses towards people. And so that's what I would say is, like, fight against the feeling of being quiet because you're fearful of saying the wrong thing. You probably will. But if you're in a relationship and you're in proximity, you could have asked that lady who is sharing with you that there's good people, there's bad people. You could have asked her, hey, because you're in a relationship and she cares for you, how to address that. My great-grandmother was born in 1913 in Georgia, who had the Ku Klux Klan marching down her street, where her father would send her and her brothers and sisters in the backyard with the animals, and they would watch them go down the street, and she would get beat up by kids, couldn't go past 6th grade, was the most amazing Christian I ever met before in my life. She instilled in me a sense of not preferring one person over another. Like, her Christianity was she didn't go to seminary, but she had the clearest understanding of what it meant to be a Christ follower. And hatred did not shape that, or being mistreated or not being able to get an education didn't shape that. That she had crystal clear perception and understanding of what it meant to walk out Christianity, even in the midst of pain, hatred, and it wasn't unbalanced. That's what shapes me as a believer and gives me hope. If she would have poured into me hatred and I can't believe white people did this, or the Ku Klux Klan, that would have shaped me in a way that would have been wrong. Now I'm free to engage in relationships and give people the opportunity to shape that. And so proximity is key. That there is no way, once you get into a relationship with someone, like you called me the other day and you said you were on my heart and mind. Like, you were thinking through the issues, and because of our relationship, you called me. Like, because of proximity, because of our relationship, because you know me, you know my story, we're in a relationship, we talk, you pray for me. Like that helps give you a person when you see this. And that is probably one of the best things, is to make sure you intentional. This is the intentional. You can't just go, well, I don't have anyone like that around me. That intentional means you go find spaces where you're uncomfortable and you put yourself in.
And one of the reasons, Charles, that I reached out to you, besides I love you, is that I think being silent in the midst of this tragedy and this opportunity is one of the things that I'm concerned about, because being silent in and of itself sends a message.
So before you called me, if you would have asked me that question, I would have said, I'm okay, I don't need anyone to call me. After you called me, I told my wife, that felt so good. But I wouldn't have cared before. If you didn't call me, I never would have said, Michael doesn't care. But remember, we're not, everyone isn't the same, right? There are some people out there who need a call. I would have said I didn't need a call. I walked away feeling loved, and I felt like you cared, that you didn't even know all what to say, but you wanted me to know that you cared and you loved me. You didn't say the wrong thing. You didn't, you were just very sincere with the conversation in the call. And I did walk away feeling loved, edified, built up in a way that I didn't even know I needed. And so, yeah, I do think and I know a lot of people who feel as though people who are being silent are part of the problem. I know a lot of young people who are very frustrated when they're not hearing things like this happen from their pastor during this time, where, it's kind of like what's happening with the virus, where we're just, all right, we're picking up in chapter 3 of John today, and the world's on fire. And it's like, wait a minute, Pastor, how should I be thinking? What is the biblical worldview of this thing here? Do you even care, or are you just afraid to say the wrong thing? And we have to be courageous. We can't, it's back to that wanting everything to just work perfectly and no one being loud. It's like, no, you're probably you're in the business of being courageous for Christ. We're in the business of trying to touch people, to reach people. We're ministers of reconciliation. Like, that is our job. That isn't something that we kind of do. We are all ministers of reconciliation, and it is our work. And so, yeah, don't feel the need to be quiet. Read, research. Don't just say anything, because that could be harmful too. Remember, we're in a very charged, critical environment where almost anything you say is going to be misinterpreted. And so we're going to have to get over that, because people are going to criticize you no matter what you say or you don't say.
You get criticized as a pastor?
I get criticized as a pastor every single day, whether I do or whether I don't. And what I have to do is the same thing I think every Christian has to do, is who am I accountable to? The Lord Jesus Christ. Who expects me to be brave in times where I want to be a coward? The Lord Jesus Christ. Who is my life in the hands of? The Lord Jesus Christ. So and this is a complete transparency, as a black man who loves Jesus, who feels the need sometimes to make sure, my evangelical friends feel safe with just my handling of the scripture, and that I'm not just being reckless, and I always feel as though I have to sometimes appease them. I'm becoming far more comfortable with trying to do the right thing than to make people happy. Because I don't think I'll go crazy trying to make everyone happy, and I think I need to be faithful to Him and then apologize if I do make a mistake. But my attempt is to honor my Father, to honor my Lord in a way that helps those who need help without feeling as if I can't.
Because having a Jesus-like heart as the motivation is what's crucial. We all will misspeak on occasion. And as I, Charles, think about what good can come from this tragedy, I'm struggling with that a little bit, but I'm pretty clear about one thing, and that is, the word that comes to my mind is intentionality. Because this is a crisis, but crisis is also the possibility for an opportunity to move forward in some way. And so as I think through this, I don't have simplistic answers, and I worry a little bit about the people who have simplistic answers in doing that. So I'm not going to try to lay that out. But I do think genuine prayer, self-examination, listening and learning, and you mentioned books to read. Years ago, I read the book Black Like Me, and that was transforming for me to begin to understand some of the African-American experience that I just wasn't familiar with. And I think to engage in meaningful conversations that are intentional, and yes, they're going to be uncomfortable, and it may be around African-American, Anglo-American relationships. It could be around Asian-American relationships. The part that I'm most familiar with is there is a fair amount of discrimination about being a redneck when you're growing up. And so we all have experienced various things, but let's at least have Jesus-like hearts to have these conversations and say, yes, we're different in some ways, but it is Christ who unites us. And let's clearly, forthrightly address when evil takes place. Let's at least agree on that.
Yeah, that's a great starting point. Just my natural wiring, I'm optimistic. The glass is more than half full the way I look at everything. I do think an awful lot of good is going to come from this. I think from I don't think we're going to just get past this one. I think this is one that's going to change for a lot of people. 6 months from now, this will be on the minds and hearts of people. I believe that personally. I think the church is going to be better because of this. I think some relationships are going to be challenged because of this. I think in a good, healthy way. I don't know. I really believe the Lord's going to use this in a way to get the attention of people who are privileged to not pay attention. They don't have to think about this, but now it is jumping in on your timeline. It is on your TV. Now your 3-year-old knows about what's happening. You can't avoid it. You can't hide. You can't close the blinds and just say that it's night outside. You have to deal with reality. We all do. And now what we do with that, I believe, is really going to be the thing that tells us in 10, 15 years from now where we really are as a people. If we fumble and we don't make changes and we continue going about life as usual 10, 15 years from now, or if we can look back and go, for me personally, I'm looking at actionable items that I can do. Like our ministry is set up in a way to address these things. We want to make sure that we change the graduation rate in our city. We want to make sure that we have healthy food options in a place where there's no healthy food options. So I have items on my list that's been on my list that are going to stay on my list that I want to make sure that maybe now some of the pastors I've been talking to saying, hey, do you want to get on board and help us bring change? I know you're going to jump on an airplane and go to a foreign country and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, but 2 miles from where your church is, where you worship, there are some great needs here also. I'm not saying don't go there. I'm just saying we could do both. And so I think there are a lot of people who will pay attention to that now, instead of just thinking that, oh, that's just some weird social justice thing that you're trying to do. I think they're really going to go, wait a minute. Maybe this is something that has happened because people intentionally created this narrative. And maybe the church can speak into that. And maybe the church should speak into that.
I'm hoping that we will embrace both biblical justice and biblical love, which really can't be separated if we're following the gospel. Thanks for sharing with us today.
Thank you.